My cruel parents taught me independence. Now they hate that I don't need them. They spent years wishing I would disappear, and now that I've made something of myself, they act like I'm the one who abandoned them. Hey everyone, before we get into the video, don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button if you want more stories just like this. Thanks for the support. My name is Ethan, and I'm 29 years old. The heavy oak door of my childhood home clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing through the hallway like a gunshot. It was a sound that used to signal safety, a barrier between me and the harsh world outside. But today, it felt like the closing of a trap. I stood in the foyer, the cool air conditioning raising goosebumps on my arms, smoothing down the front of a suit that probably cost more than the car my father drove. I was successful, independent, and utterly terrified of the two people sitting in the living room down the hall. This wasn't the fear of a boy awaiting punishment, but the cold, calculated dread of a successful man walking into a lion's den of resentment. I could hear the low murmur of the television before I even stepped into the room. It was the same background noise that had defined my upbringing, a constant, droning distraction that my parents used to avoid conversation. I adjusted my tie, taking a deep breath to center myself. I had come here today to celebrate, to share a victory that I had thought might finally bridge the uncrossable chasm between us. I had just sold my first startup, a tech security firm I had built from the ground up in my tiny apartment, an exit that guaranteed I would never have to worry about money again. I expected indifference, perhaps. I expected a distracted nod. What I found was something far darker. When I walked into the living room, the atmosphere was thick with something I couldn't immediately identify. My mother was sitting in her armchair, flipping through a magazine with a practiced disinterest, her eyes darting up to meet mine before quickly skittering away to the floor. My father sat on the sofa, staring at the news, his jaw set in a hard line that I recognized all too well. It was the expression he wore when he felt threatened, though by what I couldn't fathom. The room smelled of stale beer and lemon polish, a scent that triggered a sudden, vivid memory of standing on a chair to reach the counter, making my own dinner because no one else was going to do it. I shook the memory away and forced a smile onto my face, announcing my news with a trembling voice. I told them about the sale, the figure involved, and the freedom it represented. I waited for the words to land, hoping for even a flicker of pride, a semblance of happiness that their son had achieved something great. Instead, the silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating. My father didn't turn his head. He just gripped the remote tighter, his knuckles turning white. My mother stopped flipping pages, her hands frozen in midair, and she let out a small, dismissive sniff that cut deeper than any shout. It was a sound that said, "Asterisk, why are you still here? Why are you bothering us with this?" Asterisk, then, my father spoke. He didn't say congratulations. He didn't ask how I had done it. He mumbled something about how money ruins people, how success makes you arrogant, and how I was starting to sound just like the rich elites he despised. He said it without looking at me, staring at the television screen as if the news anchor was his only confidant. His words were like physical blows, landing with precision on the softest parts of my psyche. I stood there, feeling the weight of my success turn into a burden, realizing that my achievement wasn't a bridge, it was a weapon. Every dollar I earned was just another reminder that I no longer needed them, and in their eyes, that was the ultimate betrayal. I looked from my father's stiff back to my mother's averted gaze and understood the terrible truth of the situation. They didn't hate me because I had failed them. They hated me because I had survived them. They had spent decades crafting an environment of neglect, assuming I would wither and remain dependent on them forever, a permanent fixture in their shadowy, silent world. But I hadn't withered. I had grown. I had thrived. And now, looking at their cold, resentful faces, I realized that my independence was the very thing that had destroyed our relationship. I wasn't their son anymore. I was a living, breathing testament to their irrelevance. I set my keys down on the hall table, the sound loud in the quiet room, and prepared myself for a confrontation that was 20 years in the making. The resentment hanging in the air wasn't new. It was simply the harvest of seeds planted long ago. As I stood in that living room, my mind began to drift back to the architecture of my childhood, to the blueprints of neglect that my parents had drafted and enforced with brutal efficiency. It wasn't a story of obvious abuse or loud, violent battles. It was a story of silence, of hunger, and of learning that needing something was a weakness that would be punished with indifference. I remembered being 9 years old, waking up to an empty house on a Saturday. The sun would be streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, but there was no sound of breakfast being cooked, no voice calling me to come eat. My parents were there, somewhere, likely sleeping off a late night, or simply ignoring the morning in favor of their own solitary pursuits. But in the eyes of a child, an empty house is a terrifying place. I learned early on that if I wanted to eat, I had to navigate the kitchen counters on my own. I remember the terror of the gas stove, the hiss of the blue flame, and the smell of burnt eggs that I ate anyway because it was the only thing I had. School was no different. While other boys had fathers who taught them to catch a ball, who helped them with homework, or who attended their baseball games, I was an island. I remember the humiliation of the 5th grade science fair. I had built a volcano, a messy, baking soda and vinegar contraption that I was incredibly proud of. I stood by my project, beaming, scanning the crowded gymnasium desperately for 2 familiar faces. I saw rows of proud dads taking pictures, high-fiving their sons, but the 2 chairs reserved for my family remained empty. That night, when I came home, holding the blue ribbon I had won, I asked why they hadn't come. My father had simply looked at me over his newspaper and said that school events were for mothers and bored housewives, not men. That was the lesson. My accomplishments were trivial, my needs were an inconvenience, and my presence was optional. I learned to stop asking. I learned to hide my report cards when they were good, because praise felt patronizing coming from them, and I learned to hide them when they were bad, because disappointment was too heavy a burden to carry. I became an expert at reading the temperature of the house, knowing when to walk on tiptoes and when I could simply fade into the background. I became self-sufficient out of sheer necessity. If I needed new clothes, I saved my allowance or did yard work for neighbors. If I didn't understand a math concept, I stayed after school until the teacher got tired of explaining it. I raised myself in the shadows of their indifference, becoming a ghost in my own home. By the time I entered high school, the dynamic had solidified into a Cold War. I was the roommate who paid rent in the form of silence and good behavior. My parents treated me with a sort of puzzled annoyance, as if I were a piece of furniture they had forgotten they ordered. They didn't ask who my friends were, they didn't ask where I was going, and they certainly didn't ask how I was feeling. I was dying for attention, starving for affection, but I knew that showing that hunger would only result in being pushed further away. So I built a wall. I told myself that I didn't need them. I told myself that I was better off alone. And slowly, painfully, that lie became the truth. I forged my own path, got a job bagging groceries at 15, and started plotting my escape from the house of silence. The transition from neglected child to self-sufficient adult wasn't a lightning bolt of inspiration. It was a slow, grinding process of steel being forged under pressure. High school was the battlefield where I learned to weaponize my independence. I remember the distinct shift in my mindset during my junior year. It happened on a snowy night in the middle of winter. My car, a beat-up sedan I had bought with my own savings, had a flat tire in the driveway. It was freezing, the wind cutting through my jacket, and I struggled with the lug nuts, my fingers slipping on the cold metal. I looked up at the house. The living room lights were on. I could see the silhouette of my father sitting in his chair, watching a game. He had to have seen me. He had to have heard me cursing as I tried to pry the tire off. I waited for a moment, hoping he would come out, just to hold the flashlight or offer a gruff word of advice. But the curtain didn't twitch. He sat there, comfortable and warm, while his son froze in the driveway. After 20 minutes, I got the tire changed. I stood up, covered in grease and shivering violently, and looked at the window again. He took a sip of his drink, completely ignoring me. In that moment, something inside me broke, but it wasn't my spirit. It was the last tether connecting me to the hope of his love. I realized then that if I were to survive, I had to treat myself as my own father. I had to be the one to teach myself to protect myself, and to provide for myself. I went inside, the heat of the house stinging my cold skin. My father didn't even look up as I walked past him. I went to my room, scrubbed the grease off my hands, and stared at myself in the mirror. The boy looking back was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder, and infinitely more capable. This newfound resolve bled into every aspect of my life. I threw myself into my studies, not for the grades, but for the escape they offered. I knew that good grades meant scholarships, and scholarships meant a college far away from this silent, suffocating house. I worked after school at a mechanic's shop, learning how to fix the cars I drove, saving every penny in a jar hidden under my floorboard. My parents barely noticed my absence. When I came home late, smelling of oil and exhaust, they would just glare at me, annoyed that I was making noise in their sanctuary. There was a specific incident during my senior year that cemented my future. I had been accepted into a top university for engineering, but the financial aid package wasn't enough. I sat down with my father at the kitchen table, my hands shaking as I laid out the numbers. I asked for a loan, something I promised to pay back the moment I graduated. I didn't ask for love. I asked for an investment. He looked at the papers, then at me, and laughed. It wasn't a joyful sound. It was a dismissive, cruel chuckle that told me I was dreaming above my station. He told me that if I couldn't afford it, I shouldn't go, that the world didn't owe me a living, and neither did he. That night, I cried for the last time. I cried for the little boy who just wanted a high five, for the teenager who just wanted help. But when the tears stopped, the anger remained. That anger became fuel. I took on a second job. I applied for every grant I could find. I negotiated with the financial aid office until they gave me a work-study position. I did it all without a single word of encouragement from the two people who were supposed to be my champions. And when I finally packed my bags and left for college, I didn't say goodbye. I just walked out the door, the same heavy oak door I had walked through today, and I didn't look back. They had taught me that I didn't need them, and I was finally going to prove them right in the most spectacular way possible. College and the subsequent years of my early career were a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. I had escaped, but the habits of survival didn't vanish just because the environment changed. I carried the silence of my childhood with me into the dorm rooms and later the cramped apartments of my 20s. While my roommates were partying, sleeping in, and calling their parents for money, I was in the computer lab until it closed or coding freelance projects to pay for groceries. I didn't know how to relax because relaxing felt like vulnerability. If I stopped moving, I was afraid the hunger would return. I excelled, not because I was a genius, but because I was terrified of failure. To me, failure meant going back to that house. It meant being under their control again. So, I outworked everyone. I graduated with honors, secured a position at a tech giant, and then eventually branched out on my own. I ate dinners at my desk. I slept with my laptop under my pillow. I became the man everyone relied on, the fixer, the one who never complained. It was the same role I had played as a child, the caretaker of my own destiny, but now I was getting paid for it. During those years, my contact with my parents was minimal. A phone call once a month, usually brief and strained. They would ask if I was alive, I would say yes, and they would hang up. They never asked about my business, my partners, or my life. It was as if I had ceased to exist for them the moment I walked out the door. I told myself this was what I wanted. I told myself I was free. But there was a void in my chest, a hollow space where a family should have been. I filled it with work, with achievements, and with the material things I had never had as a child. I bought my first luxury item, a high-end watch, when my company turned its first profit. I remember staring at it in the box, the titanium shimmering under the lights of the store. I expected it to make me feel something, to validate the years of struggle. But when I put it on, it just felt like cold metal against my skin. It was a beautiful object, but it didn't warm me. It didn't tell me I was loved. It just marked time that I was spending alone in a high-rise apartment, looking out at the city lights. I was 27, successful by any metric society cares to measure, and profoundly lonely. I had created a fortress around myself, built from the bricks of their neglect and the mortar of my determination. I was impenetrable untouchable, and isolated. I had proven them wrong. I didn't need them to survive, but in doing so, I had lost the ability to need anyone. I was a statue of my own making, perfect in form but cold to the touch. And then came the acquisition, the buyout. The moment where I reached the summit of the mountain I had been climbing since I was 9 years old. It was supposed to be the victory lap. It was supposed to be the moment I could finally say, "Look at me, I made it." But as I stood in my childhood home today, looking at my parents' resentment, I realized the view from the summit was just lonely rock and endless sky. The silence in the living room stretched until it felt physical, a third presence in the room pressing against my chest. My father finally turned off the television. The screen went black, and the sudden lack of noise was jarring. He turned to look at me, his eyes cold and calculating. He didn't see his son. He saw a rival. He saw someone who had dared to defy the natural order of their universe, where he was the king of apathy and I was the subject of his indifference. He started to speak, his voice low and laced with a bitterness that shocked me. He told me that I thought I was better than them. He said that my money and my fancy suits were just a way of mocking their simple life. He accused me of using my success as a weapon against them, a way to show them up. The irony was lost on him. He was angry that I had succeeded, but he was even angrier that I didn't need his permission to do it. For a man who had spent decades ignoring me, he was surprisingly obsessed with how my independence reflected on him. My mother chimed in then, her voice high and thin. She said that I had changed, that I used to be such a quiet, easy child. She lamented the fact that I didn't visit often, that I didn't call to ask for their advice anymore. She twisted the knife of guilt with surgical precision, implying that my absence was a choice born of arrogance, rather than a necessity born of self-preservation. She said that parents should be a part of their children's lives, that I was robbing them of the joy of seeing me grow into a man. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting, a rewriting of history where the neglectors became the victims and the survivor became the villain. I stood there, listening to them, and felt a strange sensation wash over me. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. For years, I had wondered what was wrong with me. Why didn't they love me? Why was I so hard to be around? But as I listened to their petty grievances, listening to them complain about the very independence they had forced upon me, I realized that there was nothing wrong with me. I was simply the mirror reflecting their own inadequacies. They hated what they saw in me because they knew they hadn't created it. They knew that every ounce of my success was in spite of them, not because of them. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and saw a small, frightened woman who had never learned how to love anyone but herself. I looked at my father and saw a bitter man who had wasted his life pushing people away, only to resent them when they finally left. They were pitiable. They were small. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of them. I didn't crave their validation. I didn't need their approval. I saw them as they were, two people who had been given a precious gift, a son, and had carelessly thrown him aside because they were too selfish to raise him. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They were never going to change. They were never going to wake up one day and apologize. They were never going to be the parents I saw on television or read about in books. They were always going to be the people who left me alone in the driveway to change my own tire, the people who missed my science fair, the people who laughed when I asked for help. And waiting for them to be different was a form of insanity that I could no longer afford to indulge. I had built a life that was beautiful, meaningful, and entirely mine. The only thing allowing them to hurt me now was the tiny piece of my heart that was still waiting for them to be parents. It was time to cut that piece away. I didn't explode. I didn't scream or shout. The drama they seemed to crave was something I refused to give them. Instead, I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the picture frame that sat there. It was a photo of me at 10 years old, alone on a swing set, looking at the camera with a hauntingly sad expression. I looked at it for a moment, remembering the day it was taken. My mother had told me to go play so she could rest in peace. I set the frame down, face first. I turned to my father. I told him that I wasn't trying to be better than him. I just wasn't him. I told him that my success wasn't an attack on his life. It was simply the result of me surviving his neglect. I said that every line of code I wrote, every deal I closed, was a silent rebellion against the idea that I was worthless. I spoke calmly, my voice steady, laying out the truth of our existence like an autopsy report. I watched their faces shift as I spoke. The arrogance melted away, replaced by a dawning horror. They were hearing the truth spoken aloud for the first time, and they couldn't handle it. My father tried to interrupt, to bluster and deny, to tell me I was ungrateful, but I didn't stop. I kept talking, walking them through the specific memories I had hoarded like treasures, the cold driveway, the empty science fair, the refusal of a loan. I told them how it felt to be a boy in their house, to feel like a ghost haunting the halls of a place where I wasn't wanted. When I finished, the room was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of judgment. It was the silence of a verdict being delivered. My mother was crying now, silent tears tracking through her powder. My father looked older, smaller, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of his own failures had finally crushed him. They looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in 20 years. And they saw a stranger. They saw a man who was strong, capable, and utterly beyond their reach. I realized then that this was the closure I had been searching for. I didn't need them to apologize. I didn't need them to be proud. I just needed them to know. I needed them to understand that they hadn't broken me. They had tried, through their cruelty and their neglect, to mold me into something weak and dependent, but they had failed. They had created a survivor. They had created a man who could walk through fire and come out the other side smiling. They had taught me independence, and now they had to live with the consequence of that lesson. I walked to the hallway, the soles of my expensive shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The sound was crisp, decisive, echoing the rhythm of my new life. My parents didn't try to stop me. They didn't run after me or beg me to stay. They sat there, paralyzed by the reality of what they had lost. It was the only time in my life they had ever let me leave without a look of annoyance or indifference. They were finally silent because they finally understood that they had nothing left to say. I reached the front door and paused, my hand on the cool brass knob. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the house one last time. The stale beer, the lemon polish, the underlying smell of dust and age. It was the smell of my childhood, the smell of stagnation. I exhaled slowly, pushing it all out of my lungs, making space for the air outside. The air that was fresh and full of possibility. I turned the handle and pulled the door open. The afternoon sun flooded in, blinding and bright. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the foyer, turning them into tiny specks of gold. For a moment, I was 9 years old again, standing alone in the kitchen. But this time I wasn't afraid. This time, I wasn't waiting for someone to save me. I was the one walking through the door. I was the one choosing to leave. I stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind me. I didn't look back. I walked down the driveway to my car, a sleek, modern machine that represented freedom, not just transportation. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The purr of the motor was a comforting sound, a sound of power and control. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. The man looking back was tired, yes, but his eyes were clear. There was a strength in his jaw that hadn't been there before. I pulled away from the curb, leaving the house, the parents, and the past behind in a cloud of exhaust and dust. As I drove down the street, watching the neighborhood blur past, I felt a sense of lightness that I had never experienced. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was peace. It was the quiet knowledge that I had survived the storm and sailed into calmer waters. They had wanted a child who didn't need them. They had wanted silence and independence. They had spent years crafting that reality, pushing me away until I had no choice but to stand on my own 2 feet. They got exactly what they asked for. They taught me how to survive without them, how to thrive without them, and ultimately, how to live without them. I was the masterpiece of their cruelty, a creation they couldn't control. I was independent, I was successful, and I was finally completely free. They could hate me for it if they wanted, but as I merged onto the highway, heading toward my own life, I realized that their hatred was just a ghost, and I was the one driving into the sun.